Okay, I want to discuss a subject that I feel very strongly about, and I always have felt very strongly about. Um, and it's these plans to cut the number of people in short term custodial sentences announced by David Gauke, the so called Justice Secretary. I think Gauke is a disgrace. I don't think he's a strong Justice Secretary. I think he's a very weak Justice Secretary. And what's my basis for that? This is a man who has utterly failed to show any understanding of public anger on crime. I mean, we're looking at these 6 month or less sentences as being so called trivial crimes. But bear in mind, given that judges often will issue sentences that most people feel are far too lenient, you can have a situation where someone has committed serious assault. For example, an unprovoked attack on someone um, after a drunken night out, and they'll get less than 6 months. So that's the sort of crimes we're talking about. I do think that community sentencing has its place for first time offenders, for shoplifters who have not done it so many times. So I'm not against community sentencing, but prison serves a purpose. What David Gauke is doing is trying to nod to the liberal wing of his party, or rather the liberal wing of society. It's hard to believe this man's a conservative. I mean, the Tories were always supposed to be the party of law and order, supposed to be the party of holding criminals to account, whereas other parties like the Liberal Democrats and Labour were always seen as weak on crime. Here we have a Conservative Justice Secretary actually saying that violent thugs should escape prison. And yes, it does include violent thugs because that is often the sentence they get, less than 6 months. You know, the few things that enrage me as much as lack of justice. And I think Gauke needs to get into the real world. He needs to actually be with victims of crime to understand how they feel. Because when a serious crime's occurred, no sentence will bring back the victim or change the circumstances. But you know, if you've been a victim of an unprovoked assault, for example, that can cause years of anxiety. It's a major quality of life infraction. The idea that they can be released, and Gauke isn't even saying replacing it with community sentencing, is frankly disgusting. Now, I know there's a crisis in prisons. There is. They are overcrowded, and there has been situations like HMP Birmingham, Winson Green in Birmingham, where that can blow over and turn into riots. So I'm not ignorant of the fact there is a serious problem in our prison system right now. I am for penal reform, but why are we not seriously discussing the prospect of building new jails? I know that sounds very Dickensian, like there's a famous line that Scrooge said, "Are there not more jails?" But actually, this would be a pretty practical thing. Think about it. More jails would ease pressure on the system because prisoners would be allocated more to the capacity that. So, for example, instead of having four inmates in a room, you'd have two. That eases pressure on the inmates as well, makes their conditions more bearable. I don't think prison should be pleasant, but I do think it should be humane. Um, so that's one thing. There's other things, there's sort of mundane punishments like confiscating, like not letting prisoners smoke and so on. I think it's just silly. It's not, it's punitive and it's not, I don't think that sort of thing should happen. But why are we not seriously discussing building more prisons? Of course it would be expensive. These things always are. But would it be more expensive than a continuing situation of denying victims justice, of putting repeat offenders on community sentences that they will literally laugh at? I think the sentencing committee is looking for an easy way out of this. They think, oh, well, we'll just release prisoners and that'll solve overcrowding. And it will. That's what it'll do on the surface. But what about the cost then of those criminals being released, going out and committing more crime? And people say, well, that's the fault of prison because It's a university for criminals. Not if it's done properly, not if there's penal reform, which I support, but simply freeing prisoners, simply allowing dangerous thugs to run free without justice should not be the answer. And I also suspect that's why a lot of judges issue soft sentences, because they're under political pressure. Not that I think it's an excuse, I think they are often just weak and incompetent. But, you know, so much of our justice system is, it puts criminals before the victims, and it infuriates me. David Gauke can't even bring himself to call criminals what they are, to use even tough language, or at least give the facade that he's on the side of victims. So I'll be pleased to see him go, whoever the new prime minister is. It's only a matter of time. I hope they get a justice secretary that actually puts victims first. I'd like to see Sajid Javid as, I believe he was justice secretary. Um, and that would be a demotion from Holmes. I just want to see someone who puts victims first. David Gauke clearly doesn't. Because if he did, he would understand that the sort of people who are often serving less than 6 months are not just trivial, like petty criminals who've stolen a chocolate bar from a shop. These are people who are repeat offenders, who have committed serious assaults in many cases. They should not be released. Of course, there's discrepancy in the length of sentencing depending on the gravity of the crime. So obviously, they're not going to be in for the same. They shouldn't be in for the same length as a murderer. But generally, I think our system is just, there's too much focus on the criminal, not anywhere near enough on the victim. I think David Gauke's a disgrace. And you know what I find infuriating? There's only limits on what you could do. I did email the so-called Justice Committee. 12 officers they have, one to represent victims of crime. And that's from the reply they gave me. It was a very weak and dismissive reply. The infuriating thing is, I think much of the public feel utterly powerless. You can write to MPs, you can sign, set up petitions, but ultimately, the only way this changes is if there's political willpower that actually make justice mean justice. And someone who commits an unprovoked assault on a stranger, community sentence is not justice for that sort of crime. It just isn't. So I feel infuriated. I feel powerless. I mean, I do what I can do within the law. If I ever got into politics, I would do everything I can to influence a sea change. I mean, why can't we? Why can't we seriously discuss the prospect of building new prisons? That's not callous. It would actually decrease the pressure on inmates as well. I mean, the current situation of overcrowding isn't, it's making things unbearable for inmates. I don't want to see hellhole prisons. People think there's this idea that if you believe in tough justice, that means you believe in taking away human rights. And so, not at all. I think it's perfectly compatible to believe in human rights, which I also strongly believe in, whilst insisting on tough justice. So, inmates should have exercise, they should have food. If they've got medical conditions, I do support them getting treatment. But this idea that, oh, we'll just free prisoners and that'll solve the problem. It probably will solve the immediate problem of overcrowding. It won't solve the problem of repeat crime. And David Gauke, you're a disgrace because you are a criminal enabler. You are not on the side of victims. You can't even bring yourself to condemn criminals. A weak Justice Secretary who is out of touch.